What I love about this book is that he tells the stories of these 5 men in a way that brings home to the reader the dislocations of Palestinian lives. But what happens to individuals and families after they have been expelled from their homeland? You can learn about the stories in a very human way here, as well as learning about the legal case and the legal implications and the role of US-Israeli collusion. I am honored to have you here and speaking about the book.
Well, thank you for that introduction, Helena. One of the things that I learned very early on in my in looking into this case was that if there is one group of people who understands this case and understands the background to this case, it is the Black American community, because they are aware that there are political prisoners in America. And they have been targeted by the US government, by the FBI, and so forth for many, many, many years. So whereas people who are on the outside of that community and other perhaps oppressed communities within the United States don't have that understanding that there is such a thing as political prisoners in the United States. They think of political prisoners, they think of the Soviet Union, they think of China, they think of what they call totalitarian regimes. Nobody thinks that there is an issue here in the United States of political prisoners. So when I was first exposed to this story, which was the fall of 2012, just before The General Sun came out, I heard the story and I started talking and sharing it with other people, and people always nodded their heads and saying, "Nah, this is America. This doesn't exist in America." And if they were targeted and if all this is happening to them, then they must have done something. They must have done something. So really the first effort, the first problem that we're facing is having people realize that there are political prisoners here in the United States, and that is an issue. And again, like I said, obviously the Black American community knows it probably more than anyone. Now, when we talk about the persecution of Palestinians in the context of Palestine, where they've been targeted, they've been targets of ethnic cleansing, they've been a target of an apartheid regime, where there's been a concerted effort to take away their land and take away their rights, then even though there's no justifying it, it makes sense. We can understand. But having been forced to leave their homeland and then come to the United States or any other country and having that persecution continue makes no sense. It makes no sense. These people left. They are no longer a problem over there for the people that are trying to get rid of them. Now they're here. Why are they being persecuted here? And this goes back to the title of this evening, which is the collusion between the United States and the State of Israel. And one of the interesting things that comes up quite a lot in the trial, and I'm going to talk about details of the trial in a little bit, and there's a lot about the trial in the book. A lot of the sources of what they called evidence against them came from the government of Israel. This came from the government of Israel, and it came in ways that were questionable, that in any other court of law would have been inadmissible. But somehow, because it came from the government of Israel, it was admissible. It was assumed to be okay. It was all right. This came from the government of Israel. That came from the government of Israel. Then we're okay. It must have come from good hands. That means it's a good source. And those of us that know, those of us that are part of this issue, know that is definitely not a good source. And that came up in the trial as well. Now, the only way to really understand the persecution of Arabs and Muslims here in this country and the specific prosecution of the Holy Land Foundation is to have an understanding of this very deep and troubling collusion between the United States and Israel. And I talk about that and I touch on that, of course, in the book. Now, the Holy Land Foundation was the largest Muslim charity in America before they were closed down. They had programs that provided relief for orphans, victims of human and natural disasters, refugees all over the world. They helped here in the United States after 9/11, after the Oklahoma City bombing, in cases where there were floods. They were overseas and in countries where there were earthquakes, in Turkey and in Chechnya and in many, many places. War-torn areas, they were there to help refugees, they were to help the needy. And of course, their focus was Palestine. Now, they were gaining a great deal of respect. They were gaining a great deal of credit for the work that they were doing, which was excellent work. And what I believe happened is they faced this reality where here in the United States, again, as a result of this collusion between the United States and Israel, anything that is related positively, anything that relates or portrays the Palestinian issue in a positive light has to be somehow connected to terrorism. Has to be taken down, and the best way to take anything down, of course, is to connect it to terrorism, whether it's true or not. So I don't know if you remember, but several years ago there was an exhibit of children's drawings, children from Gaza, that went around the country. And from the pro-Israeli groups, there was a huge opposition to this exhibit, saying that it promotes terrorism. When people listen to poetry by Palestinian poets, Mahmoud Darwish and others, literature by Ghassan Kanafani and so forth, terrorism, anti-Semitism, terrorism, anti-Semitism. Palestinian resistance, of course, is terrorism, whether it's armed resistance or whether it's BDS, which is unarmed resistance, but it's got to be terrorism. Terrorism has to be attached to anything that is connected to Palestine. And here you had a Palestinian charity run by Palestinian Muslims doing incredible work, not only in Palestine. The work that they did in Palestine was incredibly important and provided a great deal of relief. But it was run by Palestinian Americans, good, honest people. They were credited, they were winning awards, they were participating in coalitions with other relief organizations. And that had to be stopped because they were presenting a legitimate or a legitimization of the Palestinian issue. And that cannot be tolerated. And so way back in 1993, the Anti-Defamation League and other groups began to tear them apart, to question their motives, to accuse them of funding terrorism and so on. And that's really how this thing began. So without that collusion, there would not have been this, we would not have been facing this issue, they would not have been in jail, the charity would have been able to continue. Now, you have to wonder, how does somebody sit in a room? Who is this person that sat in a room and said, we are going to conflate charity and relief to terrorism? Because it's not something you think of naturally. I mean, it takes a great deal of creativity to conflate the two. How do you even come up with this idea? And so they did basically two things. They said, well, they have programs that support orphans in Palestine. And they said, well, the orphan's fathers, the description of the orphan's father's death, the word shaheed came up. Well, shaheed, they said, we know what that means. That means a terrorist. Shaheed means a suicide bomber. Never mind the fact that that is completely not true, but that is the image. So, if they are supporting the orphans of suicide bombers, then they are supporting terrorism. Not only that, they said, and they had terrorism experts, professors and well-known people who sit on in think tanks in Washington, D.C. come up and say, well, not only is it supporting terrorism, it's encouraging terrorism because, of course, a father knowing that their children and his family is going to be taken care of is more likely to become a suicide bomber. Perfect sense. And so what the defense team did, they took the list of the orphans and they looked at the actual causes of death of the fathers. And none of them died as a result of anything that had anything to do with what you might call terrorism. Now, I don't consider Palestinian resistance terrorism, personally, but I use the term because that's the terminology that's used. So, there you have it. Then, looking at it from another angle, if we look at the profile of young Palestinians who did participate in suicide missions, they had no children. So either way you look at it, these orphans had nothing to do with acts of violence by their parents. Nothing whatsoever. But it's a good story and it stuck. The other thing that they were saying, well, they're helping the families of prisoners. And this is something that's going on even to this day. Helping the families of prisoners that are held by Israel, Palestinian prisoners that are held by Israel. Now Israel is holding and has been holding for many, many years thousands and thousands of Palestinians in prison, which Israel calls terrorists. So the claim was, if you're supporting the families, once again, you're supporting terrorism and you're encouraging terrorism. But if we take a look at the actual men, women, and children being held in Israeli prisons, Palestinian men, women, and children being held in Israeli prisons, the vast majority of them have never been charged with acts of violence. The vast majority of them are political prisoners, clearly. So that story doesn't work either. Yet, in the court of law in the Northern District of Texas, the story was good enough and they did not allow the facts to interfere with the story. So the end of the story is, and I'm going to be jumping back and forth only because that's how I was exposed to the story myself. So I'm kind of sharing it with you the way I learned about it. The end of the story is that we have 5 men. Shukri Abu Bakr, who's sitting in a federal prison for 65 years. Ghassan Elashi, also 65 years. Mufid Abdul Qadir, 20 years. Abdurrahman Ode, 15 years. And Muhammad al-Mazain, 15 years. And to say that these are good men is the understatement of the century. They're not just good men. These are the best of people. The best that humanity can find. Honest, hardworking, caring, loving, and wanting to do good. Which is precisely why they had to be taken down. Because here in the United States, as in occupied Palestine, Palestinians cannot be associated with anything that is that positive. They can be victims, they can be terrorists, but that's it. And that's why these men are serving these long terms in federal prison here in the United States. Now, I'm going to read to you a couple of segments from the book itself. And again, in the very beginning of the story, once I learned about the story, I began meeting with the families of these men. Most of them live in Dallas. And I spoke to their children, I spoke to the wives, I spoke to brothers and sisters and aunts, and the extended family, members of the community. And sometimes you hear a story and it sticks. Sometimes you hear a story and you just cannot forget it. The image just sticks. And I'm going to read to you a passage of one of these images that I heard very, very early on. And I knew immediately that, once I decided to write the book, I knew immediately that that was how the book has to be started. That's how the story has to start. And so I'll read this to you. And so 20-year-old Zaira Abu Bakr was still in her bed in her parents' home when she heard the banging on the front door. She looked at her phone and noticed several missing calls and a message from her friend, Noor Alashi. She opened the message from Noor first, and it contained one word. Aju. Aju in Arabic means they came. Now, it still gives me goosebumps. They knew, these young women, who were both daughters of 2 of these men, knew that this day was going to come. The families knew that this day was going to come. After years of being followed by the FBI, being harassed by local police, having their phones tapped, seeing their fathers go through incredible hell, they knew that this day was going to come when at 7 a.m. there's a banging on the door and 15, 20, 25 armed federal agents and local police stormed the house. And it's exactly the way it was. It was precisely 7 a.m. Central Time on July the 27th, 2004. The homes of Shukri Abu Bakr, Ghassan El-Ashi, Mufid Abdul Qadir, Abdurrahman Ode, and Muhammad Al-Mizayn were raided by local and federal officers. All 5 men, who came to be known as the Holy Land Foundation 5, were taken into custody. 4 years and 2 trials later, all 5 were sent to federal prison, serving sentences ranging from 15 to 65 years. HLF stands for the Holy Land Foundation of Relief and Development. It was at one time the largest Muslim charity organization in America. On December the 4th, 2001, the Holy Land Foundation was shut down by President George Bush without due process, using Presidential Executive Order number 13224. Federal agents raided the charity's offices and seized all documents, assets, and funds of the organization, as well as personal property of the employees. So, very shortly after 9/11, there was a sense, and this is described in detail in the book and other sources, there was a sense that something had to be done, and had to be done quick. Assets had to be frozen, organizations had to be closed, and somebody had to pay the price. So the atmosphere was, let's just round up the usual suspects. And they were at the top of the list. They were the best known. They were Palestinians. They were Muslims. They looked like Muslims. They got beards. These are the guys we want. And of course, that's exactly what happened. They were targeted and they were closed down. Now, they were closed down by a presidential executive order. In other words, the President of the United States, before there was a trial, before there was any kind of serious investigation, had declared from the White House that this was a major terrorist funding network. And then everything had to work backwards. They had to prove that he was right. They had to create the evidence. They had to bring the witnesses. They had to create an environment that proved that what he said was true. Of course, the big problem was that what he said was not true. What he said was definitely not true. Now, when the government decides to shut down an organization, then we have the means to fight it. And so the Holy Land Foundation hired lawyers, they sued the government, and they wanted to undo the designation of the Holy Land Foundation as a terrorist organization and to unfreeze their assets. This was, by the way, right after Ramadan, and so they had a lot of money that was just donated. Because around Ramadan, that's when Muslims donate. And they put together an enormous body of evidence. An enormous body of evidence. The government presents what's called an administrative record, where the government presents its evidence. And when I was talking to the lawyers that were dealing with this, that were working on behalf of Holy Land Foundation, they said the administrative record was complete bullshit. There was nothing there. A few faxed, photocopied, unauthorized, uncorroborated documents, a few newspaper articles, and a claim that one of these guys, Shukri Abu Bakr, was a member of Hamas. There were no affidavits, there was no signed documents, there was no testimony, there was nothing. So they thought this was going to be easy, because the body of evidence, it showed the Holy Land Foundation was above board, did nothing wrong, broke no laws, supported no terrorist organization, whether you call it terrorist, did not support Hamas in any way, shape, or form, was overwhelming. So they presented their case. The judge who presided, her name was Judge Kessler, she's a judge in Washington, D.C., dismissed the case and struck the evidence from the record. Dismissed the case and struck the evidence from the record. Now, you can imagine the shock. So they went to appeal. On appeal, the appellate court said, well, in a normal case, perhaps she should not have struck the evidence. However, this is not a normal case. And at that point, the lawyers realized what had happened. In post 9/11, if you're a Muslim, if you're Palestinian, if you're an Arab, you are guilty until proven innocent. You do not stand a chance in a court of law. Now, a couple of years later, the lawyers realized that the government was actually preparing a criminal case as well. What the civil case allowed the government to see is the weaknesses of their case. So what they started saying is, well, actually these guys perhaps did not give money to Hamas. They did not directly give money to any terrorist organization. They gave money to charity, to relief. However, by providing relief to Palestinians, that relieved Hamas from providing that same relief, and they could use these resources as terrorism, for terrorism. And therefore, by virtue of that, they were supporting terrorism. And they came up with a theory that the local charity organizations with which Al-Arian Foundation was working in Palestine, they're called Zakat committees, they're local charities that have been around for a very long time, they are connected to Hamas. Now, the problem with that is, it's not true. And the way we know it's not true is because USAID, which is the US government, the United Nations, the Red Cross, international organizations all over the world work with these local charity organizations, and they've been vetted by the CIA, by every country, every foreign office, every intelligence agency that there is, to make sure that they are not supporting terrorism when they provide the charity. So this was the argument, this was the problem, this was the case. Are the Zakat committees part of Hamas, or are they not part of Hamas? And what's interesting about this is that, again, all the evidence clearly showed, and still shows, that the entire world realizes the Zakat committees are professional, nonpartisan, honest relief organizations, local relief organizations. The only place where they were associated, or people believed that they were associated with Hamas, was the courtroom in the Northern District of Texas. So the government did something that was unprecedented in the entire history of the United States. They brought in anonymous witnesses, foreign nationals. One was a member of the Israeli secret police, the Shabak, and one is an officer in the Israeli military intelligence. And again, their job was to prove that the Zakat committees were Hamas, and that these guys were actually supporting Hamas. And they were torn apart by the defense team. Every single Zakat organization with which HLF was working was brought up. Their names of their board members were well known. And the lawyers, and again, this is in the book. I read a lot of, thousands and thousands of court documents, and I put in as many of them as I could in this because you have to read it to believe it. It's not about believing me that this was an injustice. You have to read the court documents to believe that such injustice, such nonsense takes place in a court of law. So they go committee by committee, board member by board member. Which of them is known to be a Hamas member? And they're asking these anonymous witnesses. Of course, they cannot question their identity. They cannot question their education or any of their qualifications because they're anonymous. They don't even know their name to this day. And none of them could say that they were Hamas. None of them. It was made absolutely clear that there was no proof whatsoever that any of these board members, any of these organizations had anything to do with Hamas. Now, another thing that I found interesting, one of the witnesses for the defense was the former U.S. Consul General of Jerusalem. Now, Jerusalem, diplomatically, is a very different kind of a place. the American consul general in Jerusalem is not like a regular consul general. Usually a consul general in a city reports to the ambassador of the country. That's not the case in Jerusalem. The Jerusalem consul general has the status of an ambassador. He reports directly to Washington, D.C. He's not part of the embassy because Jerusalem has a special status. It is not officially, it's never been recognized officially, internationally, as part of Israel. Israel took Jerusalem, within over 2 wars, once in 1948, once in 1967, and declared it to be its own capital city, but this was never recognized internationally. So the status of Jerusalem is unique diplomatically, and the status of the American consul general there is unique. He testified for the defense, and he said absolutely clearly that the United States had never labeled the Zakat committees as working with Hamas or as part of Hamas or as controlled by Hamas. In fact, he said in his testimony, they were vetted by the CIA, USAID, and other agencies worked with them. Now, what's interesting is this. This is, again, something unbelievable that came up in the trial. So there's this thing called a designation, when a person or an organization is designated by the United States as a terrorist organization. How does that work? How does somebody get designated? How does an organization get designated? And it's really beyond belief. So what's required for a designation is and I'm reading the text to get it right, is a reasonable belief. It's not, for example, proof beyond reasonable doubt. It's not proof by a preponderance of evidence, like you have in a courtroom. Okay? It is reasonable belief. Now, there are no rules of evidence by which the government has to abide in order to declare a person or an organization a designated terrorist organization. And the two bodies that do it are either the State Department or the Treasury Department. And they have the means to do it, to declare somebody that way. And the interesting thing is that both of these agencies, both the State Department and the Treasury, have lists, and these lists are published. So if you want to go and work with a certain organization, or you want to work with an individual, you can go on their website, and there's a list of the organizations with whom you are not supposed to work. None of the Zakat committees have ever been listed on any of these lists. None of them have been designated, ever. So, again, whichever way you choose to look at this, these committees have never been connected in any way, shape, or form with any organization. Now, Hamas was designated as an organization in 1995 by Bill Clinton as a terrorist organization. So, American citizens are not allowed to do business with Hamas. Fine. But none of these others were ever designated and were ever connected. Yet, once again, in the court of law in the Northern District of Texas, 5 guys with beards with Arab Muslim names and wives wearing hijabs was enough to convict. Now, another thing that I thought was extremely important because it touched me is the story of these 5 men and their families. There are three levels to the story. There's the collusion, the Israeli-American collusion, which has definitely seeped into the American judicial system, without any doubt. There is the legal issue, the injustice that took place, and there's the very personal story of each and every one of these men and their families. And I think we have to understand and be familiar with all 3 of these levels, all 3 of these issues. Otherwise, we don't get just how severe this is. We have to, and I felt this very, very, very clearly from the very beginning, because the most moving thing, the most convincing thing, is the personal stories of these people. That was my impression. So I'm going to read to you a couple of segments, again, from the book, that describe, instances of personal issues, personal things that I had come across. Now, I met 4 of the 5. I've been in touch with them since the very early on, since early 2012, the end of 2011, by email. And then gradually I met them, I went to visit them in prison. and they're in prisons all over, federal prisons all over the country, except for one. Ghassan El-Ashia was not permitted to visit for reasons that I can't, are never explained, because this is all national security. So nobody explains anything. Besides the fact that the prison system, the Bureau of Prisons, doesn't explain. So Shukri Abu Bakr, who was one of the guys who got 65 years, he was a CEO, and he was the first one with whom I was in touch. So I want to share some of the emails that he and I exchanged. And of course, he gave me permission to reproduce them in the book and to share them. So this is the first email I received from him. He says, Miko, we're out of lockdown this morning. I took advantage of my solitude to finish up some important reading that include revising my memorization of the Quran and introduction to neuro-linguistic programming. The first book I read in my first month of incarceration, and then he says in parentheses, I was in solitary confinement for the first 3 months. 3 months solitary confinement, right off the bat. The first book I read was Man's Search for Meaning by Dr. Viktor Frankl. He illuminated his secret to Holocaust survival, how to turn one's predicament into a human achievement, and how man's main concern is not to gain pleasure or avoid pain, but to see meaning in his life. He taught me that unhappiness is a symptom of maladjustment. Man's freedom is restricted. It is not freedom from conditions, but freedom to take a stand towards the conditions. Now, I dedicate the book to one of his daughters, Sanabil. And I'm going to read a little bit about Sanabil. With Sanabil out there fighting 3 chronic killers, yet holding on strong as strong as she could, waiting for her daddy to come home, for me was heartbreaking. I knew I wasn't coming home anytime soon. I know Sanabil might not be able to make it till I had the chance to come home. She's rapidly weakening, her lungs functioning at 24% now. I don't know how much longer she'll be able to wait. Cystic fibrosis, thalassemia beta, and diabetes are at work, but so is her fighting power and her resilience. Enjoy your days under the sun. Surprise your loved ones with an act of love or kindness. Make little things happen in their lives, allowing for bigger things to manifest in them. And always let love live. Shukri. Then he shared with me an email that he received from Sanabil after the first time I met the families. I flew out to Dallas and had a gathering. After I decided that I wanted to write this book, I wanted their permission, I wanted their blessings, I wanted to see what they thought. So there was a meeting in Dallas with all the family members that were in Dallas. And she was there, and she was extremely excited by the whole thing. So I'm going to share this with you. She says, and this is again an email she wrote her father in prison. Salam Baba. Today all the families met with Miko. His idea is to write a book specifically about the HLF case. He wants to tell our stories, and he's going to do some research and get some contacts in Palestine to interview the people, see hospitals, schools, and orphanages that receive the aid. It's going to be a big project, but I'm so happy it is going to happen, inshallah. His idea is to get it out to the public, to the American media, and hopefully to reach the higher judgment here in America. Oh, and I got his book, and he signed it for me. I'm going to start reading it today. Inshallah, this will be a great project. He mentioned you talked to him today and how excited you were. That's so good. I'm happy you talked to him. Yallah, talk to you tomorrow, inshallah. And I did speak to Shukri. I spoke on the phone several times. Then a year later, I received the following email from Shukri. Sanabil is on her deathbed fighting for her life. Please keep her in your thoughts. Her mission on earth is about finished. She says she won't go before she can see me. I said, baby, I'll always be there with you, no matter when or where you go. May Allah have mercy on all things. Shukri. And then a few days later, the email that everybody feared. And the beginning of the email says it all. In the name of Allah, the most merciful, the most compassionate, Sanabil passed on Tuesday, May 14, 2013 at 2 a.m. She went peacefully and gracefully. She will be buried today. I praise Allah for what He had allowed me to keep with my remaining daughters, Zaira, Nida, and Shuruk, and my wonderful wife, Wijdan. And Shukri was not permitted to see his daughter before she passed away. The next one I want to share with you is a story that has to do with Ghassan. Ghassan is the other gentleman who got 65 years, and the one of the 5 that I was not able to visit. But we exchanged a lot of emails. And he describes his family history, where his family came from, and so forth. And so there are a couple of passages I want to share with you regarding Ghassan. I don't need glasses for this. Ghassan's father was Midhat Abdul Ghani Elashi. He was born in Palestine in the ancient port city of Gaza in 1923. Coincidentally, this was the same year my father was born, also in Palestine, in the northern port city of Haifa. Even though the two would never meet, their fates were linked. The catastrophe that befell Palestinians like Ghassan's father and his family and turned them into refugees was a result of the new state of Israel for which my father and his generation of Jewish colonizers dedicated their lives. My father joined the armed militia while still in high school, the very militia that in 1948 conducted the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. Then, after 1948, once the Jewish militia became the Israeli army, my father became a career officer. Ghassan's father finished high school, graduated from Birzeit University, and then worked for the Palestine Bank. And Ghassan described to me an old farmhand that was working on his grandfather's estate. His father and mother left and worked. His father had a job in Saudi Arabia. He and his brother remained in Gaza and lived with his grandfather, who had a beautiful estate. Now, if you're familiar with Palestine, the southern part of Palestine is well known for beautiful dunes on the coast. There are these beautiful dunes and the fragrance of orange blossoms in the season. It's really unique. It's really unique. So this farmhand, his name was Al-Arabi, and he used to take Ghassan and his brothers and tell them stories and fables, Arab fables and so forth. And Ghassan wrote to me about him. He says, I remember once during a dark night when I stood with Al-Arabi on the roof of my grandfather's house. Al-Arabi was enjoying the soft sea breeze, the fragrance of orange blossoms that was in the air, and he was smoking a cigarette. As they stood there, Ghassan noticed the lights of Jewish cities and towns beyond the boundaries of the Gaza Strip. Looking toward the sea, Ghassan could see the endless sand dunes that are typical of the southern coast of Palestine. At one point, barbed wire cut through the dunes. Don't ever try to cross this barbed wire, or the Yahud will shoot you, Ghassan was warned. And indeed, I know, and many of us know, that Israeli soldiers were under orders to shoot Palestinian infiltrators on sight. And Palestinian infiltrators were Palestinian refugees who tried to leave the boundaries of the Gaza Strip and go back home. At one point, Ghassan asked, why are the Arab nations unable to liberate Palestine? And he asked this out of the blue. Al-Arabi inhaled the smoke, enjoyed its effects for a moment, and then blew it out slowly through his nose and mouth. He looked at the young boy, and then, placing his hand on his head, said, as long as America is helping Israel, we will never win. This was a pivotal moment for Ghassan. I remember, he wrote to me, I remember it as though it was yesterday. I didn't know anything about America except that it was far away. This is, by the way, the early 1950s, a long time ago. Now, one of the things that the prosecution was trying to show was that these men were associated with the Muslim Brotherhood. Whether they were or they weren't, there was a lot of discussion about the Muslim Brotherhood. And so I dedicate quite a bit in the book to talk about the Muslim Brotherhood and who they are and the significance, both in the story and their significance in the Arab world. And I don't know if you remember, but shortly after Trump was elected president, Ted Cruz, and I forgot who, a couple of other senators wanted to introduce the bill to designate the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist organization. It never happened, as far as I know, but that was the bill that they introduced. Now, the last one of the five that actually met was Mohammed al-Mazain, And he was actually, he lived in many parts of the country, but he's from Gaza, and he ended up in San Diego, and his family's in San Diego. And he was, by the time I saw him, he was in Terminal Island, which is near LA, right on the coast. And I visited him also several times. And one of the times I visited him was immediately after this bill was introduced. Now, he's the oldest one of the group. He's around 70 years old. And he's not well. He's a big man with a big white beard. Very impressive man. And I sat with him in prison. I'm sitting, we're in prison. In the visitation room. And he's in overalls, prison khaki overalls. And we're talking about this. And he looked right at me. The guards are over here sitting. Other inmates and their family members are sitting all around. And he looked right at me and he said, I am Ikhwan. Ikhwan are the brotherhood, the Muslim brotherhood. I am Ikhwan, he said. They will never change me. They cannot change me. I am Ikhwan. And there was a sense of dignity and pride and fearlessness. And I could understand why all the others were looked up to him. He was like a spiritual guide. He was a spiritual leader. At a very young age, he already knew the Quran by heart. A highly educated man, even though he came from refugees. He was the first generation, really, of refugees born in the Gaza Strip in the early 1950s. Highly educated man and so forth, both in Islam and otherwise. And there's a sense of, a strong spiritual foundation this man has. And one of the interesting stories, at one point, when they were all arrested, they were all in a particular prison and they in transit. And they put 2 in one cell and 2 in another cell. These were adjacent cells. And one of the things that these guys have done and continue to do is something that is incredibly important for Muslims, and that is to memorize the Quran. And he was the guy who memorized the Quran. He was the source. So he's in the cell with one guy, and the other 2 are trying to memorize what they remember and they don't remember the whole thing. So they're trying to call him through the vents to help them recite this particular part of the Quran that they don't remember. And there's this unbelievable exchange, and they described it to me, so I described it, to the readers, to everybody else. This unbelievable exchange where they're trying, there's the vents, and there's an echo, and they're all a little bit older, so, the hearing is not great, and they're going back and forth, and they completely dedicate themselves. I think if it was me in that situation, my mind would explode. I would just lose my mind. They are dedicated to this mission of reciting the Quran and memorizing the Quran, and that's what they were going to do. And they do it in this amazingly, lively spirit, which I thought was, again, just an incredible testament to the strength of their spiritual foundation. So that's Muhammad al-Mizain. Now, one of the 5 who has a story that is really unique, that really should not have been there, was Mufid Abdul Qadir. He did not operate the foundation. He was not part of any operational part of the organization. He was a volunteer. He would show up for fundraisers. He would sing. He would do skits, things like that. But, and this is something that comes up in the trial as well, and I mention it the way it's brought up in the trial. His brother is Khalid Mash'al. Khalid Mash'al was for decades the face of Hamas. The head of the political bureau of Hamas, which I believe is the reason they brought him into the story. Because, he's the brother of Hamas guy, so he must be a terrorist. This was the argument. And so, as I'm going to read to you, so for some reason, I was particularly apprehensive about visiting Mufid the first time I traveled to Terre Haute, Indiana to visit him. And to be honest, I would have to say that it might be because his brother is Khalid Mash'al. And I wasn't sure if that would mean anything in the context of our meeting. And of course, I'll never forget the first meeting, and I'll never forget that trip to Terre Haute, Indiana. Now, Mufid is about 3 years older than me. He has large eyes. He's very tall, deep wrinkles around his eyes, prominent nose, and a very finely chiseled face that you can tell even though he's got this beard of a sheikh. And he said to me, here in the prison, you have to make your identity clear. He says, being part of the Muslim group is an important statement. And then he says to me, he flips back and forth his accent from speaking like an Arab to speaking like a black guy to speaking like a white guy to speaking like Hispanic. And he says, this is part of the prison. So he said to me, don't be offended when I call you a white boy, but this is how we talk here. And he quickly changes his accent from one to the other. And we're sitting there, and he's jovial, and he's almost like he thinks this is funny, and they're like, this is great fun. We're sitting in the prison visitation room. He can't get up to go to the bathroom without permission. I can get up, I can go, I can come. They have vending machines, terrible vending machines in the prison visitation room. He can't get up to look at the vending machine and pick something. If he wants something, I have to go, tell him what they're offering today, go back to him, and then he doesn't have any money. I have to go and get it for him. Yet he's sitting there and we're talking like old friends for 5-6 hours. And this is how he's describing prison life to me, as though this was some kind of a fun camp. And of course we know very well that it's not. And then he described to me what it was like before he was put in the general population. All 5 men were put in a special prison called the Communication Management Unit, called CMU. And we're sitting in this medium security prison in the visitation room, and there's children and families and so on. And in the CMU, the visitation is only through plexiglass with a phone, so there's no contact. And he's looking around, he says to me, for 7 years I had not seen children running around. I had not heard the voice of a baby cry or seen a mother pick up a young child. He hadn't seen couples embracing one another. The voices of babies and children he was used to hearing as a father were denied him at the CMU, where only non-contact visitation is allowed. And then he told me, when my daughter came with my grandson, I asked the guard if she would hold the baby just for a moment to allow me to kiss him once. It's against the law, she said. Against the law? Mufid made a disgusted face. His eyebrows came together and his mouth was frowning. For me to kiss my grandson is against the law? And then the 5th guy that I in the group is called Abdurrahman Ode, and his connection to the whole thing is also very, very strange. He was offered, from the very, very beginning, he was offered a deal to cooperate with the feds, to cooperate with the government, and he refused. And time after time after time, federal agents came to him, a particular one that was later a key witness for the prosecution, and asked him to work with us, to work with the government, and he refused flatly. Finally, at the very end, she said to him, this federal agent was a woman, you're going to be sorry, you're going to pay for this. Yet, even during the trial, and then the second trial, because there were 2 trials, they tried to get him, and he could have been out after several months if he agreed to a gag order. And every time they would come to him and they presented him with his deal, he would say, gag order? And they would say yes, and he said no. Because a gag order means they can say that he admitted to something and use it against his friends. And he was not allowed to say anything. So I'm sitting with him again in the visitation room. He's wearing these khaki overalls. He's in for 15 years, and he says to me, thank God, I feel fine. I did not betray my brothers. And I heard the story first from one of them, and then he confirmed the story. And so it's an incredible story. And the feds always try to get people to work for them, and they offer them all kinds of different things. He could have been out in less than a year if he agreed, not even to collaborate, but just agreed to a gag order to not to talk about the case. And he refused, and he got 15 years for this. Whereas some other people were not quite as strong, and I talk about this as well. Some other people that were there. Now, the prison system is something that I feel, it's hard to find the words. It's such a horrifying phenomenon that you don't even know what to say. And the fact that the prisons are tucked far away, the people in them are tucked far away. We don't see them. They don't see us. Even cities and communities where the prisons are, federal prisons exist, it's always at a distance. You see these fortresses. And so I talk about that. I said, young men turn into old men within these walled structures, deprived of the basic right of seeing the outside world. These fortresses have a life of their own and are ruled by laws that we on the outside cannot even imagine and would prefer not to know. But no, we must. We as a society have placed these men here, And since the United States has the largest number of prisoners of any country in the world, more than any totalitarian regime has ever had, we must be held accountable for what takes place between those fortified walls. And for me to go visit one of them, and I visit all four several times, it's a huge expense. You have to fly, then you have to rent a car, then you have to stay at a hotel for a few days, and sometimes you get there and there's lockdown. So you went through all this effort and there's nothing you can do. It happened to me only once. It happened to the family members many times. And you can imagine an entire family has to go. 5, 6 people. It's an enormous expense, and emotionally. And then you sit there for a few hours, and then you leave. And there's a sadness that engulfs you when you leave someone in prison that is beyond explaining. It's beyond words. And again, I wrote the book. I think it's funny that I say I can't find the words, but sometimes you just can't find the words, Especially now, if they were guilty, it's still too horrifying. It's still not justified. But these are innocent men. And, at the end of the visitation session, the whistle blows, inmates go to one side, visitors go to the other, and then you leave them there. And you have absolutely no control and no recourse. There's nobody to talk to. It's a terrible, terrible feeling. And families, I stood in line with family members going in. It takes hours to get in, and, it's a long process. And you look at the family members, and you look at the parents and the children, and you think, they go through this. I love these guys. They're not my family. And just the sadness, leaving them there was beyond belief. So I think this is something that this American society in this country has to start talking about and crying about and screaming about, because it is so inhumane. It is so wrong. Besides the case of these 5 men. So I do touch on that. So basically, there was a civil case like I described earlier. That didn't work out. Then the government built a criminal case. They had a trial that ended up with a hung jury. Not a single guilty verdict. One of them, Mufid, the brother of Khalid Mash'al, actually was found not guilty on all counts. The judge said not guilty 32 times. And then when the jury was polled, one of the jurors suddenly woke up and said, no, actually, I didn't mean it. I didn't mean it. I made a mistake. I didn't mean to say all not guilty on all charges. So immediately the judge called for a mistrial on him as well. So he was this close to being a free man. 32 times the judge called not guilty. And this man is in for 20 years. The second trial started. The government changed the indictments a little bit, because now again they really knew what they could get away with and what they couldn't. They brought in evidence and witnesses that were not allowed in the first trial, that the first judge didn't allow, the second judge did allow. Documents that were, again, uncorroborated evidence that should not have been admitted in any court of law. But again, it came from the government of Israel, and that made it okay. And they came out with all guilty verdicts at the end of the second trial, all guilty verdicts. They tried to appeal, and the appellate court once again said, yes, mistakes were made. However, once again, this is a special case, and they also said something strange. They said, well, actually, the mistakes that were made in the second trial were harmless, even though these mistakes, these differences between the first and second trial, brought about convictions. That's the end of the story. The Supreme Court wouldn't hear the case. And then there was this hope that President Obama on his way out would sign clemency. And the deal was, and there was a real coalition that was put together, that was sent out overseas. They went to Turkey, they went to Qatar, they went to other Muslim countries that are, friendly countries, I suppose. And they were willing to give them citizenship and take them in, if Obama would, provide clemency and deport them. And there was a serious effort behind the scenes to get this done, and President Obama wouldn't even pick up the file. He was not interested. Because politically, of course, to release 5 convicted Palestinian Muslims, politically wasn't going to work. Now, I believe when I was visiting Mufid when this was taking place, when just before Obama was leaving office, and he said to me, "What do you think is going to happen?" and I said that I'm not gonna bullshit you. There is no way that an American president releases you. The only way you guys are going to be released is when all Palestinian prisoners will be released. Because their case, they are political prisoners. They're Palestinian political prisoners, just like the thousands of prisoners who sit in Israeli prisons. There is no difference. And none of these people are going to be released until Palestine is free. Which could seem daunting, which could seem incredibly depressing unless we act. I believe very strongly that whether or not Palestine is free, and when I say Palestine free, I mean all of Palestine. I mean from the river to the sea, I mean from the Galilee in the north to the Nakab in the south. I mean the entire country. Not this little piece or that little piece, the entire country. And I believe very strongly that it is within our ability to make that happen, but we must act. So people say to me, well, when do you think Palestine will be free? If we act, it could happen next year. If we do nothing, it's never going to happen. And there's a connection between what is happening in Palestine and what is happening to these 5 men. It's a direct connection. It's a direct correlation. Which is why I wear this pin. I believe that not the only, but probably the strongest force working today to free Palestine, to free Palestinians, to end the injustice, all aspects of the injustice, 2 million people in Gaza in a concentration camp, these 5 men in federal prison, and everything in between, is through boycott, divestment, and sanctions, isolating Israel, making sure that no Israeli consul general, no Israeli ambassador could ever go anywhere without a protest, that Israel is not allowed to participate in cultural and sporting events here in the United States or anywhere else. When we act, when we support the Palestinian call for BDS, for boycott, divestment, and sanctions, when we mobilize, that's when these men will free, that's when all of Palestine will be free. So I want to invite all of you in kind of come out from the depression, come out from the sense that this is daunting, and get up and do something. Get up and act. You know, it's one of the reasons I'm really glad that our friends from Neturei Karta are here, because they know how to act, and they know how to mobilize, and they know how to fight the system. And they do it all the time, in a remarkable, courageous way. But we all need to participate. We all need to be wearing these badges. We all need to be making absolutely sure that every store, every department store, every agency knows that this has got to stop, that we will not stand for this. And when we act, then these men will be free and Palestine will be free. Thank you all very much.
The 5 men's families do have a website. It's called freedom.Give.org. Let's have some questions for Miko.